Hey everybody, welcome back to Amar City. In this part I'm working on a new part of the city, which is going to be an extra island. And what's very unique about this one, as you might be able to tell from the title, is that I'm starting work on a beach and a boulevard along with it. And this is something which is kind of special for the city already, since I won't be adding too many beaches to the city. I'll get into exactly why later, but just it's one of the few spots where I'll actually have a proper beach. And for me personally, it's also the first time that I'm ever making a beach in this game, so it's really an experiment and I'm just trying to see how it goes. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse. So the first thing that I wanted to do is draw out a canal which will separate this island from the other island which I have on the top of this, because there will be 10 islands in total. These will be quite small, but they'll sort of form pairs. So this is one pair with the island above it, and we'll sort of share that marina and city center with it. So it's really just a very small canal separating it, but this island, unlike the other one, is actually gonna have a beach, and this is something that I had to draw out before I actually went into this, and I did a bit more research on than I usually did, because I wasn't really sure how to approach making a beach, since this entire project is made up of artificial islands, much like a lot of the stuff that you'll find in Bahrain or in Dubai, and I've never really looked into how these beaches should be made, because they're just completely fake beaches, and actually in many cases I believe the sand in Dubai and countries like that isn't actually good enough to make artificial islands out of, so they're importing sand from other places, and they're some of the least natural beaches that you can find usually. So this was kind of new territory. So I drew it out at first after doing a little bit of research, in which I wasn't actually that successful at finding stuff. The first thing that I wanted to get into were these weird little shapes which I have around that little beach area which I have right now, which are going to be the future breakwaters of this thing. I wanted to get breakwater in here, since after just looking at Google Maps for a very general basic orientation, I found that many of the beaches in Dubai have them, or pretty much all of them, and while I couldn't find any resources on exactly what the sea currents are like, or how like coastal protection is done in Bahrain, I did see that in a very, really in the newest development, which is a super large development called DR Al Muharraq, they are actually putting exactly these kinds of breakwaters next to the beaches. So I pretty much modeled the look of the beach after the beaches in that development, and see if that could fit into the city. It's slightly on a different scale, but this should more or less make sure that it's good. And the reason for that is just because of all of those factors, these islands being man-made, the currents in the sea, the way that everything is laid out, really, I was pretty sure that I cannot have an unprotected beach over here. Put some sand in there and it's just gonna be thrown away by some currents and eventually diagonally moved by the waves, and your beach will over time be disappearing. So I definitely wanted to protect this beach, and that's basically why I wanted to have these large breakwaters around it. And that was really my very basic research. I only had like some super basic Dutch high school knowledge of them that I half forgot anyway. But the most important thing about this is really that it's modeled just after the ones which I already found in Bahrain, because I can't exactly get the exact details of how I should make these, so I'm just going safe and building it just like they are actually building it over there. And that should hopefully make the beach as realistic as I can, while at the same time it kind of contains it within a small area. And this is also one reason why I didn't want to get too many beaches. It's sort of hard coming up with the layouts where these beaches smoothly flow with the actual hard shorelines, which are just boulevards next to the water, which I'll have mostly on the sides of the cities. And so there will be a couple of beaches along this outer ring of the city, but they'll all be kind of small beaches like this one, and just all contained within their little space. And that's basically the way that I'm approaching this. Now back to some of the buildings which I'm building here. I'm pretty much doing just about the same thing, experimenting with a few different buildings. I found this office building, which is just an in-game office building, and one that I've always loved using for offices, but the weird thing about it is that it has a lot of balconies on it, And it looks very residential to me, and that's something that I figured might as well turn it into some residential towers, put it next to this other tower which is functionally a residential tower as well. And that should give you a pretty nice gateway into the city. The large canal which I have over here with the bridge is like the main gate into the city when you're looking from the sea's perspective and when you're going straight onto the downtown towers. So I wanted to make sure that, you know, it's at least impressive looking. I put my tallest towers in there. Also, even though all of these developments might be pretty large, much of these I figured should be residential, and in-game are residential as well, since this won't exactly be a tourist hotspot, and this won't exactly be an office or commercial area either. And instead of having like hotel or office towers over here, residential towers should hopefully make a very good use of the view which you have on this corner, which is some of the best views around the entire city, arguably, since you're looking straight at sea. Which is generally, you know, it makes a lot of sense, but that's generally why I wanted to have the tallest residential towers right there next to the sea, to make use of all of those views. And the rest of this block at least is kind of interesting, because there is going to be quite a bit of commercial in this block, but it's really going to be the only place. Generally, I want to make this an interesting beach with a nice little boulevard, but really if you want to go for some serious high-density commercial or office spaces, then you'd either have to go to the small sub-downtown, which is in the island next door, or you'd have to go to the real big downtown of the city. So this will just still mostly be residential areas. I'm having a little bit of trouble catching up with the video though. I actually lost some recording over here since the game crashed. I have no idea why it happened, but I haven't had it since, so I'm praying that it doesn't happen again. But at this point I was kind of just rebuilding what I already built earlier, which is why I just sort of speed built my entire way through it, exactly knowing what to do, which isn't all that handy for a time-lapse. Or at least it's extra fast, I suppose. Now here I went into the first parts of the boulevard, which is just really simple. It's just a bunch of buildings, some of the tallest buildings in the corner here. And most importantly, I wanted to dress it up nicely with the foliage and some of the path details, in order to make it actually look like a cozy boulevard, but it's not going to be anything too special. It's not like this is the city center or anything like that, really. And that block, which I've finished at this point, is the only busy block, I would say, with some commercial. I'll put a restaurant in there as well. But this one, which is now still empty, is all just going to be mostly residential and just houses that are looking onto the sea. So it's not like it's gonna be a kind of boulevard where you've got all of these different restaurants and tourist traps lined around it. It's really just for the people who are gonna live here. And here I wanted to do a little bit of work on the backside of the island, which is the boring part, definitely, and not the part that I'm most looking forward to doing. And usually I am actually procrastinating on these kinds of parts and just skipping straight to the interesting things like the beach, but this is something that I had to do for a bit to at least make this part of the island look finished and get an idea of what I'm doing here. And so stylistically, I'm just following a lot of the things that I was doing earlier on in the last episode, so I'm using the same buildings, kind of tucking those together to make some larger residential buildings, and generally fiddling a little bit with the kind of layouts that I'm having here. The thing that I had most trouble with here is that I did want to have some way for cars to actually go here. So there is one road where cars can go, and what I also wanted to do is at least have one parking lot garage per island, so that at least as a car user you can definitely get around in the city. It's just not as extremely convenient, but it should definitely be possible, which is also why I have all of these two-lane roads basically connecting all of the different parts of the city. And so this is the part where I had to fill in one of these squares with a parking lot for cars, and that was kind of tough, but at least it's somewhat compact because I'm trying to avoid using parking spaces in open areas as much as I can, since they just kind of break up spaces and fill in areas which you'd rather have filled in with actual nice things instead of just endless parked cars. I mean, just as a very small side topic, I don't know how many people have actually seen the kind of damage that parking lots have done to downtowns in America. And definitely in recent years it's been a trend to repair these and fill in these lots as much as they can with new buildings, but there are still many downtown areas in America where so many buildings have been demolished in the last century and replaced by just endless parking lots, where all of the densities that skyscrapers could give you are pretty much outdone by the endless field of asphalt just around the side of all of these towers. And that's something which I absolutely wanted to avoid over here. Having parking spaces in the open air really is a very good way to waste space. So trying to get all of my car usage to be as compact as I can. I suppose, you know, my project over here is to quote-unquote make a sustainable city and make something that I figure would be a good sustainable city in this kind of environment. But at the end of the day, Bahrain doesn't even have a real network, and I definitely don't want to step into a 100% car-free city. I definitely want to still make it possible, if you're arriving as a visitor, to get to places by car and to at least get to some decent places by car. I'm just trying to keep it as much to the background of the city as I can, so it's not open in plain sight. The busiest areas are completely car-free, and you can get to things with a car, but I'm trying to get the car usage as much out of the life of the city as I can, which is kind of why, you know, the only real car roads are the important connecting areas, but in most places there are just garages and parking lots tucked away at the backs of the places where you're actually going to be. I also found out about this very interesting podcast that I listened to recently, which really grabbed my attention because I was super hyped about the cars. What do you call them again? Driverless cars, there we go. I was super hyped about driverless cars for a while, just like many people probably are, and figured, you know, why not just put this into a city that's made for driverless cars, because surely that's sustainable in a way and that should work. But I think, honestly, and especially in this case, public transport is going to work much better, because something that I heard in the podcast, and I think it was with one of the urban planners of Vancouver, not 100% sure though, but he mentioned that one of the big issues of driverless cars would be that, you know, so many people will be using it as a very convenient way. It's a much more convenient way than regular car driving, so many people will be using it as sort of their personal transporter and having their car drive toward them wherever they are. And so a sort of very basic traffic rule, which basically means the more convenient you make it to drive, the more people are gonna drive, kind of might hold in that sense, and just more and more people might start driving cars when there are driverless cars, paradoxically. And that's kind of why I wanted to avoid that issue as well. I mean, I don't want to go too far into this discussion, but it's something that I found very interesting and something that I didn't really think about earlier on. But it's something which, you know, it's a reason why I wanted to put this city in sort of a safe zone where it doesn't completely ignore cars or leave cars out of the city. It's just trying to manage them in as much of a good and least obtrusive way as it can. But back to the topic of the city that I'm actually making here. I put a bunch of these different sort of mid-rise apartment buildings over here. I haven't actually started doing any of the low density yet. It's something that I might want to start doing on this island as well. The thing is that many of the still empty areas on this island and on the island which I built in the last episode, many of those empty areas are basically meant to be filled up with some low density housing. It's just that it's tremendously boring and I still had to get myself to get to it. It's just kind of filling in row houses in a simple pattern, and that's just about it, so I still have to get to that. But in the meantime, I'd much rather just place some trees and make some beaches, because this is where I actually got into making the beach itself, which is quite interesting. I got the restaurant which I used earlier on in the city to make that like very small pavilion where you could eat, and I figured, you know, this might work as a beach pavilion. And that's basically what we have going on here. There's just gonna be one, because this is not the biggest tourist hotspot ever. But it's at least a nice place to sit down and have some food at the beach. A small lounge and lots of lounge chairs on the beach itself, which I'm getting to right now. Still not too many, but it definitely dresses up the beach quite nicely and actually makes it look like a beach instead of just a random collection of sand. I know I haven't talked about this either, but I love the color of the water just around the beach. It's just that beautiful transition to a slightly green color, which came out so well. I'm really happy with how that turned out. The breakwaters are a little bit on the fat side with all of those rocks though. Would have liked it if they were a little bit more narrow, but I more or less need the roads that are shaping out the shapes of these breakwaters. So there's not, as far as I know, there is not any kind of way to make those breakwaters a bit more elegant. So functionally they should be working right now, but that aside, they're not the most beautiful looking things. For the beach though, I don't think it really matters too much. You just want to have sand, the sea, the sound of seagulls, and maybe the sound of waves in the background, and that's pretty much what you're looking for probably. Might be a little bit too hot in this kind of climate to have a beach, but you know, that also kind of makes it perfect for it. And just finally dressing it up with a little bit of foliage. I was really careful not to overdo the foliage on the beach, since I really just wanted to have a small overgrowth of some bushes, a few palm trees, and a few scattered rocks, but really keep it as subtle as I could. And then moving on to the advertising on the buildings, to make them look a little bit more interesting. I'm not the biggest fan of placing advertising everywhere, but it does make these buildings look a bit more alive and a bit less like they're completely uninhabited. So putting some billboards on these things and some signs on the bottoms to make it look as if there are some actual shops down there, which there aren't. They're technically offices, but we'll pretend that they're shops anyway, and the rest is just residential. Filling in all of this stuff with some planters to make it look a little bit more inviting, and filling in the backs of these buildings as well with some very simple foliage in these sort of outback courts which I have in the middle of these blocks. Something which actually only struck me very recently is that accidentally the floor plan, if you will, of the downtown of the city is very much like the super blocks in Barcelona, where they have this grid layout with all of these densely packed buildings, where it's really just inside those rings of buildings where you know, all of the backdoor services are, and that's something which layout-wise but also functional-wise you see a lot in this city. What I wanted to avoid is having these long strips of roads where you would be able to supply the shops and the restaurants in the front of buildings, and instead just have these smaller courts, kind of like very old cities would, where all of the stuff that you don't want to see is basically tucked away. So that's something that just very quickly struck me while I was working on this and looking again at the layouts of the city that I have so far. And it's something which you can see in here as well, even though I'm just very easily and quickly filling in these little courts between the buildings. It's generally where you would have the boring stuff that you don't want to have in plain sight as you're walking on the boulevards of the streets of the city. Which is a bit of a crude explanation, but I hope you get my point. Basically, it's, you know, I think it's a bit more of a efficient way and inviting way to build a city than having these streets everywhere where you don't want anybody to go. Because part of walking in a nice city, to me, is being able to walk into some random streets and not end up in a total dead end and a place where nobody would ever want to go. Which kind of reminds me of a video of the School of Life, which a lot of people have brought up in the comments. So I'll talk about it very briefly in this video as well. There's basically a School of Life video, I'll link it down in the description, about like what a good city should be. And if I could criticize the video at all, I would say that it's very subjective, which is not necessarily bad. It's just they're kind of sort of presenting to me the ultimate truths of building a good city. Even though I do believe on many of their points, and you can actually find them back in this city as well. Kind of like the point which I just mentioned, like being able to just explore a city, setting it up so that you can just randomly walk through it and get into cool areas, but also that buildings should be different enough to be interesting, while at the same time be similar enough to be recognizable as part of the same coherent city, which is also something that I wanted to make sure in this city. It's actually why I would say there are a little too many buildings that are like the exact clones of themselves scattered throughout the city. Like, I am sure that I have some apartment blocks already like 40 times within the same city here, which is something which, even though I'm not a fan of it, it's just an in-game sort of hurdle since there aren't too many buildings that sort of look alike. It was an important decision for me since I wanted to make a city that would look more like planned than an organically grown city with just random buildings galore and all in new. So everything in here is new and somewhat in the same style, but I also wanted to avoid having a city where everything has the same color and the same bricks and materials are used everywhere, which is also, I think, a pretty common pitfall for any kind of newly planned city, and I definitely wanted to make it look much more organic than that, which is also why, in a sense, many of the buildings do use different textures, and I wanted to switch up the kinds of buildings quite a bit still. A bit more, perhaps, than you would see in such cities in real life, where really everything is planned to go perfectly together into some kind of ensemble. Anyway, that is just about it for today's episode. There's a bit of boring stuff ahead, but I won't really bore you too much with that. I'll just skip straight into the cinematics, which should show off this area quite nicely. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'll see you guys next time.